I'm at the Real Organic Conference, and I'll share a little bit of what I've learned here.
This is a one-day conference at Churchtown Dairy held in this barn. And this event brought together a few hundred people for the day. The barn is really unique, and I'll link some videos about how it was built.
Check all of them at some point. Yeah. Cool. Did you sign this?
I did. Right there.
And if you're a vegetarian, please go to the right. If you want chicken or you are grain-free.
I love that each cow name is above every stanchion. And this time of year, it's late September, going through the gardens, you can tell things are still really vibrant, but you can tell it's ready to turn to winter. I went to a session on food as medicine. I went to another on hydroponics and organic, and then many speakers talking about PFAS and so much more. Welcome back to 5 Acres Honey Farm. I'm Tara Lynn, and as I just shared with you, I was at the Real Organic Conference in Hudson, New York, which was held at Churchtown Dairy. And I wanted to share just a few highlights of what I have learned there. I have also a much more extended post on my Substack, which you could check out for more in-depth on some of the sessions that I attended. And I'm planning several posts over the next few months that go into some of these topics in greater detail. The one that really stood out to me, and something that I have been researching on my own over the past few years, is the prevalence of PFAS in our environment, and particularly what was covered at the conference is how PFAS is introduced into our environment through the application of sludge on farm fields. And this was something that I had learned about in the past few years, where I had heard that in Maine there was a warning to hunters that they should not consume deer meat from the deer because the deer were eating corn in farm fields, and apparently the deer were testing very high in PFAS, and it was because of the corn being high in PFAS, which was because of the sludge that was applied to those farm fields. There have been also, particularly Real Organic has done a recent podcast interview with a farm that was directly impacted by sludge application that had been made many years prior to them acquiring their farm. And this prompted me to research what about our area and what is happening around us. So if you are in North Carolina, I'm including a link to a map. It has not been updated in a few years, but it's at least one resource where you can see where sludge has been applied to farm fields. And it was surprising for me to see that a farm just a mile away from me has 3 different instances of sludge being applied to it. So that's, I think, an important resource. And then, depending on where you're located, you can search for those types of permits in your area so that you can have a better idea of how you might be exposed just being near some of that application. But also, if you're looking for property and you want to avoid acquiring land where there has been previously had PFAS applied to it, I feel like this also encourages folks then to have their water tested and things like that. Another big thing that I learned from being at the conference, and this is just really alarming in general, I understand how many farms we're losing every year, but particularly for dairy farms, one of the stats that was shared is that Vermont has gone from 200 dairy farms to 120. And I don't have in my notes the time frame that has happened with. I feel like it was just within the past few years when it was being presented. And the other alarming statistic that was shared is that Vermont is outpaced in dairy by 3 times as much dairy by New Mexico, which is really depressing because it's just showing you the volume and the scale of the confined animal feed operations that are happening in the Southwest and how that's taking over the dairy market. I haven't listened to it yet, but there was a reference to a podcast by Scott Myers, and I will look for that podcast so that I can link it. But apparently he's been researching because of his own interest and as he's acquiring grain for his cattle, but what kind of contaminations are in organic grain. And it was really alarming to hear how even though he sourced and purchased organic grain, when he had it tested positive for fungicides and herbicides. And when he contacted the supplier and said, this isn't organic, it has chemicals in it, that the supplier was saying it's actually fine because the paperwork says it's fine. And so what happens in this sense, I had no idea that this was impacting farms in the way that it is. And, farming is already hard enough as it is for folks. So why add this extra layer of bureaucracy and, and all these challenges to deal with on top of that. And, people unknowingly feeding tainted grain to their animals when they think they're doing the right thing and going to the effort of sourcing products that they believe in, but then it turns out it's not. And I feel like it really carries over to consumers in the sense that they may be paying more for feed for meat that has been raised on organic feed, but it just falls down the whole chain because now these consumers are unknowingly consuming food that is from animals that ate tainted products. So it just is this really depressing loop of poor practice. Although I'm sharing a lot of depressing information, I feel like part of the silver lining of all this is the awareness and being able to educate others on what is happening in our food system and really getting that information out there. And I feel like just going to a conference like this allowed some exposure for me to see a lot more of what is happening across agriculture and what's really holding farms back from doing what they want to do or doing what they're intending to do, and how they're getting stalled in those processes. I will preface that this is more depressing news, and there was a really nice presentation on food as medicine, and one of the speakers at that presentation was Bob Quinn of the Quinn Institute. Bob grows wheat and particularly ancient grains like kamut. And Bob shared a story of how he was exporting his grain to Europe, and Europe has different standards for like what chemicals can be in the grain than the United States has. And he grows organically, so he was shipping it over to Europe, and they had tested his grain and it tested too high for glyphosate. So he needed to research why this was happening because his growing practices don't include that. And what he was able to determine after losing a third of his sales to Europe is that his fields were being contaminated by rainwater. So as other farms are spraying and utilizing glyphosate, that evaporates or it runs off into waterways and then evaporates and enters the ecosystem. And then as weather systems move across the landscape, that is then dropped on his land when a rain event occurs. So those are things that are on my mind as I'm gardening and like on my own and not on the scale of that which these farms are doing. And so hearing that this is a reality of something that I've just kind of always wondered, like, am I going to all this effort to grow food in a way that I believe in? And then every time it rains, I could be getting PFAS on my water, on my garden, or glyphosate because a farm or another property owner has applied it. And hearing this story just underscores that yes, that is very possible and most likely is happening. The last piece I'll share here, and there's a lot more in my Substack post, is that the bigger surprise that I learned, and this is also something that's, kind of on my mind, but you just don't really hear of anybody providing any information about it yet. So I feel like we're just at that, the precipice of really learning more about these things. But I'm kind of referring to these more processed foods that have been entering the market that are marketed toward the growing population of vegan and plant-based consumers. So looking at these highly processed vegan products, they are synthetically created, and in some cases they're created through modifying the genetics of plants to produce a certain outcome, and utilizing different fungi to get their ultimate product that they want to be able to be shelf stable and to be able to produce at mass scale. So also at the session that I went to on food as medicine, I have to check his name, but he's from the Natural Grocers grocery store chain, which I was not familiar with. They're primarily on the West Coast, but they had tested a vegan product, and the test came back with, I found this really alarming, 90 molecules that have never been studied before. And just not knowing what these things are, as we're, as a culture, producing these genetically modified and synthetic ingredients into the foods that we're putting into our bodies, but what are they doing to our microbiome? What are they doing to our long-term health? What are they doing to the environment when they leave our bodies and dispersed among waterways, and maybe then consumed by other animals or leached up into plants that are consumed by other animals, and just how this all connects, and not knowing what those long-term impacts are for the health of any being and for the planet as well. That was something that caused me to pause a bit and just think about what types of products, when at times when I might have highly processed foods, where are these being produced, and how and to what degree are they being processed in that sense. And perhaps this might be a sign to reduce consumption of highly processed foods even more until there's more information about it. It is a kind of a strange thing if you stop and think about like what we are allowing into our bodies when things come in a nice package. It's just kind of been part of our culture, at least what I've grown up with, is seeing things in packages, but there's so much not regulated and so much not tested. And it's prompting me to consider, just out of curiosity, potentially looking into getting some testing some of the foods that we eat, whether I produce them or if they're grown elsewhere, just to see what is out there, what's the baseline, and have a better understanding of what we're putting in our bodies over the long term. So again, a lot more information. Don't want to overwhelm you, but there's a lot more on my Substack, and I will include a link to that. It's taralintoday.substack.com. Everybody receives all of my posts regardless of whether or not you have a free or paid subscription. Paid subscribers have certain perks, which you can read about on the site, and they might have some expanded content from time to time, but I will continue to share more next time.